Welcome to the Near East by Midwest podcast with the NISA department here at The Ohio State University. Today I'm joined by Professor James Moore, who is a philologist and social historian of the ancient Near East and ancient Mediterranean here at OSU. His research primarily focuses on the intersection between religion, economy, and empire in the ancient world. He's published extensively on Hebrew and Aramaic literature and scribal culture, in addition to editing hundreds of Northwest Semitic texts. He's also pioneering the integration of digital tools and resources into the study of the ancient world, its languages and cultures. And he is the creator and co-director of the Digital Lab for Ancient Textual Objects, also known as DELATO, here at OSU. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thanks, Selma. I'm glad to be here, and we're really proud of what you've been doing with this podcast. You've been a great success. So
thank you for support. Well, due to supportive mentors like yourself. So, as a historian, You do a lot of reconstructing origins. But if we invert that lens, could you speak a little bit about your own origins as a scholar? What got you interested in the ancient Near East, and what's kept you interested?
Well, I began fundamentally with an interest in religion and its place in society, modern society, and my undergraduate work was really in religion, and I began religion and philosophy was the core of my studies in the first few years, and then I realized that wasn't for me. I felt like I had answered the social questions around religion that I went in wanting to know the answers to, the modern questions. And I also didn't know what to do. I thought it was too late to bail and to do what I was probably going to do in the first place, which was engineering. And so I pivoted towards ancient languages. This is one of my biggest frustrations with philosophy, was the lack of data and the overinterest in self-proclaimed ideas. I wanted to know what was actually happening in the context of the ancient world, and so I started studying more vigorously the ancient languages, particularly Hebrew and Aramaic, and then also Greek. And that sort of began the path, and the more I did that, the more I enjoyed it. And it took me many years and programs, but I ended up here.
Well, we're happy to have you here. So, what is social history? What makes social history different than other histories?
So, history in general is often including social history or the interest in social institutions, and social history at its core is an interest in the social institutions. And then that is the focal point around which all other historical data will then pivot. So cultural ideas, individualism, these kinds of things. And I'm interested in social institutions really because this is what the data shows us most. If I had in my data set a lot more individual private letters and prayers and things, then I might be interested in a different type of historical recreation. But at the end of the day, my approach is always to be as deductive as possible. And so the data for the last decade or more has been documentary texts that are focused around administrations and empires. And so institutions and social institutions in particular are at the core of that. So,
I mean, when you work with these ancient objects, there's always the miracle of preservation, that they even existed till today. But the thing is, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And there's always this question of what isn't preserved? What are we missing? So if the ancient Near Eastern world was a puzzle, how many pieces would you say realistically we actually have in comparison to what we don't have or don't even know that we don't have?
That's a very good metaphor. The ancient Near East is like a puzzle. It's like a puzzle that you've found at a yard sale that was a 10,000 piece puzzle. It's missing a lot of parts. Some other puzzle pieces have been mixed into it. And the box is effaced and you can't see what the picture is supposed to be. And so you just throw it on a table and see what happens. I would say that depending on what time and place and language that you're working in, we have more data than we do in other times and places. And so I've gravitated towards the textual data because those are my interests. But we have to include in this the non-textual data as well. And the problem with the ancient Near East is that it is so diverse and so vast. I mean, an average historian in our history department, their expert focus is in less than a century. Now, to be fair, in some locations in the ancient world, we have enough data to actually write micro-social histories, and this is what I've done with the most recent project. But very often that's just one little window that we are just lucky to have, and then it disappears. And we have to fill in the gaps. And most of the historical enterprise is gap filling. And because I am so heavily invested in the data, I take a slightly different approach than most historians who are heavily trained in theory and approach and structure. For me, I'm very much driven by elements of social or historical fallacy that drives a lot of my reasoning. And I really engage in role playing. I want to just sit down and imagine that I'm there, that I'm part of this. And so to do that, I draw on, whatever life experiences I've had, and some are better than others. And it seems that most of the scholars in my field don't completely hate what I do, so it's not so bad.
Well, let's go into that window that you mentioned. So you spent a lot of time researching the Judean community at Elephantine, and I want you to sort of take us there, set the scene, so to speak. Where is it? When is it? What imperial forces are at play? And where does the Judean community fit in?
Well, in a nutshell, the Judean community at Elephantine was a colonial plant that was established sometime in the late 6th or early 5th century BCE. And it was established at one of the southern regions of ancient Egypt, known as the first cataract of the Nile. This is a part of the Nile that you can't traverse with a boat, so you have to get off and walk around it. And there's a way of doing that. But in today's context, it's in Aswan, ancient Siene, and not much farther south is the modern Sudanese border. And so you have a very southern Egyptian region with all of these interesting natural and topographical features that are very different than the stereotypical view of ancient Egypt, which is often based in central Egypt, Thebes, or up in the Delta, which is where most of the economy was focused. It's not entirely clear how this community began. There's a lot of scholarly debate. I propose, because all of the evidence, I think, leads to the idea that the Persians planted the Judean colony alongside of other communities of often Northwest Semitic people groups that were centered around their temples. They gave them land and temples, or land to build temples, and they established these colonial presence. And the point of that presence, in my argument, is just to culturally reform Egypt. Egypt traditionally is very difficult to maintain and hold. Even the ancient Egyptians had a difficult time in earlier periods, controlling north and southern Egypt. And so when the Persians take over Egypt in 526, they they have to come up with a policy. And it's not so clear what was happening in 526 when when Cambyses comes in and takes over. But when his successor, Darius I, comes in and takes over, there's clearly a lot of administrative reform. And this is happening at the middle management level and higher. And Darius tries to integrate the native Egyptians into the system, but he also wants to make sure that Persian culture and ideology are starting to infiltrate Egyptian society, because that's a part of the cultural program of their empire. It was a rather unique program. Not many cultures or empires prior to them. First of all, there weren't many, the Neo-Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians. But they didn't really try this. This was sort of a new experiment. And it was an attempt to keep the peace, I think. It sometimes worked, sometimes didn't. After a century or so, it really devolves. The site of Elephantine is an island in the Nile right across from the ancient fort of Siene, which the Persians invested in as a public works project and rebuilt Siene. The island was a temple island to the Egyptian god Khnum and had been there for many centuries before. But the Judean temple was granted some land which is literally across the street from the Khnum complex. And so the contrast of cultures couldn't be more stark. Again, other Northwest Semitic temples were planted in the Siene fort, but this is by chance. It happens to be that the Judeans were put on the island, and by chance, this is a great trove of documentary sources. And for an ancient Egyptian site, this is rather remarkable. Most people think about ancient Egypt and they think about the great documentation we have, but most of that comes from tomb finds. And that's an idealized, curated like capsule. Whereas in the few sites that we have a large cache of documentary sources, we can really expand and explain the history of ancient Egypt. And fortunately, we have Elephantine, which has a continuous documentary record from the Old Kingdom up into about the Middle Ages. And some of that record is spotty because it's an island and it was renovated, and so records were moved across the island at different points in history, and some of them lost or destroyed, or groups of them. But we do happen to have a good collection of documents, most of which come from roughly the second half of the 5th century BCE. And they document the workings of this Judean temple, particularly its administration, and a handful of the major players in the temple, as well as the community environment, as well as their interaction with the state, the imperial state. So it's a rather lucky find, and that it happens to be Judeans, the same people that are associated with the preservation of the Hebrew Bible and stuff. It was a very sensational find when it was first discovered, really at the turn of the 20th century. It's still an active archaeological site today, and so they're still finding more texts and things. And also at Siena now is actively being dug by the Swiss Institute, and so there's so much to be done. I have only recently tried to piece together all of the documents from this very narrow window of time to give at least a new perspective, and from there I'm sort of moving on to other things, but but we'll see, because the book's coming out and then you have to do the book tours, and so it'll be
Yes. The upcoming book is Aspects of Judean Life, Elephantine, and its Persian imperial and administrative context. You also have an article coming out titled A Supposed Diaspora Community at Elephantine, or How the Persians Reinvented Judeanness. Can you, begin by explaining the title? It seems that it's a sort of question. What's being debated here and what's at stake?
So, because we have this trove of evidence from Elephantine in particular, a lot of effort has been put into trying to understand why there's a temple to the God of the Hebrew Bible here at Elephantine. In the Hebrew Bible, some of the writers, and certainly the loudest voices in the Hebrew Bible, are ones that are interested in a centralized temple in Jerusalem. That's an idealized perspective, but early scholars took that perspective and used the Bible to try to reconstruct what was happening at Elephantine. The problem is we don't have any religious texts from Elephantine. Again, all we have is documentary sources and the evidence of a temple. And the temple is always sort of a passing remark. We learned about it first in, I think it was 1908, because it's referenced in a land deed contract as the object of inquiry was in proximity to the temple of Yahweh. That was it. And that's the kind of info we have. So Bible scholars jumped on this, and they've spent 125 years trying to understand Judean religion, and the only way you can do that is to invent it. And so they invent it normally by using the Hebrew Bible. My question was, well, what is actually a Judean? The actual contracts and state documents refer to Judeans. Why in the world is the state referring to Judeans? And what does that mean? And I started to explore then from the data we have, and it became rather clear that in the Egyptian province, this may or may not work for neighboring provinces. It certainly doesn't work for every state in the empire. But for the Egyptian province, I was able to deduce for the first time an imperial administrative structure based around land holdings. And this is what the book is really about. And I use a lot of evidence from other provinces like Babylonia or occasionally Idumea or somewhere. And I try to explain how the Persians had a royal estate level of administration, and this was uniquely high-class Persian. And it was a bureaucracy that was centered at Saqqara in the north, in the Nile Delta, and ancient Memphis. And it managed different forts along the Nile Valley. And these forts were then capitals of districts. And so you have this two-tiered state system. The imperial bureaucracy, which is directly managing district-level administration. And then the district is made up of these communities, two types. The native Egyptians, of which there's varying temple communities of Egyptians already, and then these colonial imports. And the district is really spending a lot of its administrative power just managing the people. And so most of our documents are administrative lists, for instance. What's fascinating is that even though we know that they're getting rations and such, most of the lists are not about these things. They're about the people. Who is where and when, and does the state either take taxation and resources from them, or is the state giving them or allowing them to have rations? And so the communities are the ones that are doing the labor, really, not just for the state, but for themselves to help manage their own groups. And that is the primary structure of the Egyptian province. There are a couple of outside communities that are managed differently. And so when you think of it this way, it then really comes down, especially when you're looking at the data, into to understanding that to be a Judean means that you are an administratively constructed identity. You are a recognized people group by the state. Basically, it's a checkbox, more or less, And everyone has to fall into these categories of recognized groups, and one of them is a Judean. And once you think of it that way, the entire history of scholarship of the religious question, it gets turned on its head, or just questioned in general. I mean, where do you go from there? And so that's really what this article that you are referring to is about. It's a proposal that I gave by invitation at University of Copenhagen a couple of years ago. And yeah, it should be out soon, and we'll see how it goes. It's certainly raised some eyebrows, but so far we'll see how the battles turn out.
Well, so what does this temple of Yahweh in Elephantine tell us more broadly about the role and function of a temple in the ancient Near Eastern world? Is it, from what you're saying, very different than what one would perhaps expect?
Yeah. So in the ancient Near East, in particularly Semitic-speaking communities, temples were foremost economic and social centers. That's what they were. And they had been that way since we have the dawn of written record in Mesopotamia. And that's how they continued to exist well until certainly through the Ptolemaic period, Hellenistic period, and sort of at the end of that period, you start to see a slightly different shift towards religious identity as it can be defined in more modern terms. But before that, temples were economies, and yeah, you were part of that temple, but you were part of that temple because of proximity. You lived in that region, and that's how a social institution works, especially. And so in the history of Mesopotamia, as well as the Levant and the Eastern Mediterranean, in these Semitic communities, there's always been a negotiation between the state and the temples, and the state as a larger abstract notion of government run by a palace, but then the temples are really what support that palace. And there's always been a negotiation between the leaders of the temple and the royal courts. What the Persians did was a new thing, and they took a model that their predecessors, the Neo-Babylonians, had tried out of sheer control, which was to take a royal official and plant him inside the temple as an administrative auditor to audit the finances. Well, in the ancient world, taxation occurs in two forms: economic, financial, and economic labor. And so the Persians came in and they saw that this was kind of working, but rather than having that individual work alongside of a temple administrator who was controlling the labor still, they just put this state official above him as well. At which point, both the finances and the labor have to answer to the state official rather than the local priest, and took away their power. And that little move is really the move that I see that through a series of unexpected events, Persians didn't intend to do this, of course, but I think that they invented the trajectory that develops into what we know as religion today.
Very interesting.
Because now everyone's vying for resources. And with the state, because now the state, and it's in a larger multi-ethnic group and communities and settlements. And so what it means to be a Judean, the Persians still ultimately left that to the temple priests to figure out, or what it means to be a follower of Nanai or of Nabu or of any of the other gods. The priests had to figure that out, but once they figure out, there's a critical mass of people who can or cannot be involved. And so this is where I think most of the religious conversation that appears in the Hebrew Bible is spawning from. What does it mean to be a Judean in this type of administrative age, an age where it doesn't really matter what your regional boundaries are? Because before the Persians and before this use of the temples in this way, everyone was ethnically identified by their geographical boundaries. But now you have these institutions that can be satellites and can be planted anywhere. You can carve out a Judean temple here, here, and here, and a temple to Nabu in any province. And so now, and this is happening for the first time on a large scale, things like this we know existed prior to the Persians, but the Persians are using it as an administrative and imperial tool. And that's what really, I think, changes this notion of identity, and as such, really gives birth to the rise of religion as we can start to historically trace it.
Very interesting. There's a lot more to ask in that regard, but I'm going to move a little bit. One of the texts that we find at Elephantine is the earliest version of Ahiqar. And you've written on Ahiqar quite a bit. For those uninitiated, who is Ahiqar? What is the literature attributed to him? And yeah.
So the story of Ahiqar is the most famous story you've never heard of. And it's a story that is about a guy who works as one of the chief scribes, actually looks like the chief scribe of the Assyrian court, which then would be set somewhere around the year 700 to 680. It would be the narrative setting of the text, and it's during the transition of power between Sennacherib and Esarhaddon. So famously, Sennacherib was assassinated, and Esarhaddon was not the first choice to be his successor, but ends up becoming the successor. And so it's during this major time of courtly problems, and that's the political setting of the book. And this scribe, he does something that's rather unusual, and he wants to retire. This is not something that you normally do in the ancient world, and so he wants to go and retire and spend time on his vineyards hanging out. And in order to do this, he has to have a successor and put the successor in place. And he doesn't have a son. This is probably because he's a eunuch. And so he tries in the beginning of the story to figure out why the gods wanted this to be. And ultimately, he gets the sign that he needs to have. He needs to adopt his nephew and train him in his place. And so he adopts his nephew, whose name is Nadin, and he trains him to be a courtly scribe. And then when he's old enough, he puts him before Esarhaddon, and Esarhaddon interviews him, and then he gets the job. And so Ahiqar goes and retires on his vineyard. And then problems arise in the court, as they tend to. And one big problem arises, and it's around taxation of imperial states. And Nadin can't solve the problem. He gets very angry about this. Because everyone thinks, well, Ahiqar could do it. And so he then forges documents in Ahiqar's name, because he was his successor. He has Ahiqar's seal. And he basically tries to start an internal revolution and coup in the empire, in the name of Ahiqar. So now Ahiqar is hunted for treason by the king, and then it goes into this elaborate backstory. All this to say, it's a really exciting tale, and the whole point of it is ultimately to teach wisdom literature. At the end, at the end is a series of Aramaic proverbs. It was originally written in Aramaic. We don't know when. I would put it after a couple of historical events myself. but it was certainly rewritten in the Persian period and then circulated widely. And we have a copy of it from these documents related to the Judeans at Elephantine. And that is the oldest copy. Prior to this, we had copies that were really only from the Common Era and late in the Common Era, the best ones surviving in a large group of Syriac manuscripts. Most of these Syriac codices coming from after the year 1000 CE. But it turns out that it's a really ancient tale. It was really popular. Scholars had already deduced that it was influential on biblical writers. It was influential on later Arabic writers. It was influential on Greek writers. In fact, the life of Aesop, the great fabulist, his narrative life is just the Greek retelling of Ahiqar. And there's some speculation that it even went farther into Indian literatures and things. So it was this international sensation for a long time, and it was found there. And it tells us a lot about, in particular, the situation of the Persian Empire and its use of Aramaic as its imperial language, and the place from which that Aramaic derived. That is, it uses the Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian Aramaic administrative culture from Mesopotamia as its imperial language, and it's trying to propagate this. What I was able to deduce in this most recent book was to show that after the ascension of Xerxes in 484 BCE, we already knew that when he rose to power, there were revolts in Mesopotamia and Babylon, and Babylonia in particular. But what we learned is that there were also revolts in Egypt. In Babylonia, we had known for now, common knowledge for quite some time, that he had basically killed the scribal culture of cuneiform and Akkadian Babylonian writing, and replaced it with Aramaic. So he basically took what was already there and turned it upside down. We have evidence now that shows that Cyrus had already done this when he took over around 550. But now Xerxes is enforcing Aramaic only as the administrative language at the imperial level, whereas players like Darius the Great, who were before him, they allowed for multilingual administrative activity. And so the story of Ahiqar is one way of promoting this Aramaic agenda. And this is one way you control a population, is you control their language and their education. And so it's a very fascinating text. And I've written some on it, and I actually will return to it this year in a series of lectures that I'm giving somewhere, and then probably later as my next major research project will be based on that manuscript, but not really what Ahiqar is about. That will just be a sort of secondary thing, but what the erased text underneath Ahiqar on that manuscript is about.
I mean, that's kind of tempting. What do you mean by erased text?
So in the ancient world, papyrus was very expensive, and there was a whole papyrus trade, and also reusing it was part of that process. The state sponsored a lot of papyri production, and so that means then that a lot of the first uses of papyri were for state means. And this is true of this very long roll that the Ahiqar manuscript survives on. And we're able, because of the way it was written and erased and then overwritten, we're able, especially with infrared, to read the erased text. And the erased text includes a number of administrative compositions, the vast majority of which constitute import and export taxation lists and other things, dealing with Ionian and Phoenician ships coming into the Nile Delta and beginning their trade route up the Nile, and what the state takes from their ships as a tax that allows them to do business in the Nile Valley. And so for me, this is a really important starting point, because in the story of Ahiqar, at the end of it, in these lists of proverbs, we get a lot of training for what it means to be an imperial intellectual. One of his proverbs says something to the effect of show a Sidonian, that's an ancient Phoenician, show a Sidonian the sea, and show an Arabian, and then it's broken, but probably the desert or something like that. And what this is, and then it says their modes of work are different. And the point from an imperial point of view, especially in Egypt, is that, well, now that I have this system in place of how the land holdings work for people who are in Egypt, how are they connected? And so my next major project is trying to understand the relationship. It began trying to understand the relationship between the Achaemenid Empire and the Phoenician Mediterranean market economy, because it's very clear that first of all, what we call Phoenicians just refers to people who use the Phoenician language. Many of these are people from the Eastern Aegean, Ionia, Cilicia, Caria, things like that, even down into the Eastern Mediterranean, where the famous Phoenician city-states, as described by the Greeks, sit: Sidon, Tyre, Akko, but also Cyprus and things like this. All of these people are used by the Phoenician or by the Persians as part of the transport industry. And that's really my next project, is to understand what the transport industry is like. By sea, it's these groups, and by land, it seems to be very frequently Arabs or Arabians. And so I'm trying to understand how that system works, especially with the rich Egyptian data we have, but then also where these people pop up in Mesopotamia, or in Persepolis, in the capital, things like this. So,
very interesting. We'll have to look forward to it. So I'm sure working with a palimpsest so it would be a palimpsest, correct? So I'm sure that takes a lot of close study of the manuscript itself. And I remember in the intro to NELT class that you taught, one time you brought in like the kit that you use when you go to study these ancient materials. So could you speak a little bit about what it's like to work intimately with ancient objects, ancient texts, manuscripts, amulets, etc.? And what do you take with you, and how do you deal with such fragile materials?
Yeah. So fortunately, and let me be very clear. One reason I do Elephantine is because it was the job that was available when I needed a job. And fortunately, the people involved in making sure I was hired were very kind and able to make that happen. And it was focused originally on working in the Berlin Museum on the Ahiqar manuscript, but also all of the other papyri. They had found a box of papyri there that had been uncatalogued and was from excavations of Elephantine done by the Germans in 1906 to 8. And they were just fragments. They were the fragments that the people who did the first publications of all the great German finds couldn't read. So it was a very challenging task, and that task really solidified my love for manuscripts and manuscript culture. Day in, day out, I was just consumed with understanding how one little fragment, what I can say about one little fragment. And to do this, I had to map out how the fragments fit into a larger document, and then understand how scribes worked with those documents or writers worked with those documents, why they constructed them, how they folded them, where they wrote, what were the limits of their writing. And once I realized that so many of these were Persian administrative documents, and that the Persians, as part of their administrative curriculum, standardized so much, from one little fragment I was able to determine how it was folded and sometimes where it would fit in an entire manuscript, even if I only have a couple centimeter square fragment, due to formulas in the text and everything else. And so that was a real great learning experience. I learned a lot from the great epigraphers of the last generation. While doing it, they were very helpful and supportive to me. Bezalel Porton, Andre Lemaire, Emile Puech, and these guys that have spent years, decades, literally, working on similar texts. And so that's really what started my love for this, but also realizing that this needed to be taught. This is one reason I came to OSU, rather than staying in a research position, which in many respects was the dream job, because all I had to do was to sit down and work on manuscripts all day, and that was great. And now much of my life is just administration. But the point is to train students so that there's a body of students out there who can do this, and do this with the more modern tools that are now available, and that I had to use in order to just get my work done in a time-efficient manner, and learn to use. And so, that's really how I came to love and study manuscript culture. And so I trained the students very practically here. As you know, I tried to have lab environments really rather than classrooms. And so that means that you need to know what toolkit you need to take with you when you're on a 2-week grant to go to an institution and look at objects or manuscripts that are relevant to your topic, and how to use them, and what kind of cameras you have, and how to use digital cameras, and how to shoot in multispectral technologies and things like this. And then, of course, the database stuff to speed up the process. So there's all sorts of things that need to be taught. And so that's what I have spent my time at OSU trying to do.
Well, you touched on something very important. So as I mentioned earlier, you created Delato, the digital lab for ancient textual objects. So one of the things that I feel like you've really taught us in the classroom is the importance of not necessarily depending on other people with technical expertise, but to sort of gain that expertise ourselves, at least as it's relevant to our discipline, for various reasons. And you talk about also, the generational transformation from a generation of scholars that's not familiar with these tools, and cultivating a generation that is. As far as I know, OSU is the only NELC department where students exit having been required to be trained in computer skills and digital technology for the study of ancient sources, which I think is really unique and really fantastic. Could you speak a little bit about how those databases work, what people can use them for, and how people can get involved if they're interested?
Yeah, so my time in Berlin working on these fragments, but even before that, as a graduate student, I was interested in how especially just organizing my life and my research could be more effectively done on a computer. And so early on as a graduate student, I would toy around with databases to try to understand, this was before the popularity of Zotero and things, and all of the other bibliography reference work databases were paid subscriptions, so I didn't have that kind of money, and I would just make my own. And then I started playing around with putting texts in that because the Bible softwares and other types of software that were coming out with ancient texts that were in editions were also prohibitively expensive for me as a grad student, but things that I knew that I needed. And so when I went to Berlin, I really dove deeply into computer training, I guess. And this is not uncommon. So in earlier generations of scholars, particularly in the 90s and such, if you were an Assyriologist and you couldn't find a job, it was very common for you to go into the tech industry because you know how to learn technical and difficult languages, and you can learn a computer language, at least be functional in it, in just a matter of months. And then you're on your way to an actually, in many respects, more valuable and sound career. And so that's those skills, though, are very easy to pick up for someone who's a philologist and knows how they think and how they learn languages. So it's not as scary as your fellow graduate students will have you think when you have to take that class next semester. But yes, I incorporated, when I moved here, a lot of the database building into my pedagogy, because I was able to publish this box of fragments that would have taken a normal traditional epigrapher about 20 to 25 years to publish. I was able to publish it within 3 years, and that was because the database that I had put all of the data into was helping me fine-tune my research questions, but also helping me do really advanced, complex searches that I can't keep in my head. And so I had many conversations in Europe, and I also worked on many digital projects producing digital editions. So the Berlin Museum continued to do work in not just these papyri, but all of its papyri from Elephantine, and produced digital editions of these things. And I have good colleagues in Europe that are working on various types of digital editions. And so I thought the best thing to do was to help train students whom they can actually employ. What I found was the model in Europe, unlike the States, the model was that there was a large pot of grant money in many of the European countries, and they were willing to fund digital projects. The problem is they tended to only give funding to elite scholars, and these elite scholars didn't know how the digital projects worked. And so they would then have to budget a huge amount for tech into these otherwise not so large grants. And then the problem, and that lasted for a couple decades, and the problems were quickly surfacing after the first 5 years. These things often run in 5-year cycles. That how do you continue to fund these projects? Because once you have something digital, it takes money to keep it alive. And it takes money to keep it not just alive, but up to date and useful in other software or in related software as software changes. So not just maintaining the server, but then moving and migrating the software to better software as that comes along. And that was just unfeasible because these grants would end and there was no money. And so the easiest solution was they would hire, when they could, people who were doing the work as the philologists, but also had some training in computer science to sort of mitigate this. And so there were many, many good scholars that have spent, especially the last 15 years or more, in and out of Europe on projects, who are very good scholars, but they've spent a lot of their time also working on the tech side because the projects needed that. But we had to learn it all on our own. Or for whatever reason, at some point your career path converged in these two disciplines. And so when I came here, it became clear that that's just the only viable viable, I think, path forward for employment for the students, but it also gives the students a foundation in which they can do something other than traditional philology or Bible scholarship and expect to be a professor. They can actually go out and use these skills and what I so what I normally teach is an SQL class. So I teach one of the computer languages and it's the one that is most used in relational databases. And I show from the ground up how to build a relational database, and then how to use it to keep, store, and then exploit linguistic data, and also to tie that linguistic data to the metadata of the object so that we can do really interesting types of research queries regarding what we know historically or archaeologically about the object and related now to its content, and do immediate searches in this regard. And so I teach students how to build Postgres databases because this is all free open source software. It's the best software there is for this. All major academic institutions use this in their science departments as the back end for all of their data anyways. So there's going to be stability in this software. It has been and it will be for years to come. And so I that's what I originally started to do. But I had this research database of my own. We have a colleague here, Ahmed Al-Jalad, and Ahmed is associated with the Oceana project, which was originally a FileMaker database working out of Oxford. And it became clear that we could do something with all of my data and with Oceana. And so I proposed that we build this lab. It's a conceptual and digital lab, which is quite nice because that means we're not always vying for space and resources at a limited institution. But the university and the arts and humanities has been very supportive of all of this. And so we built this sort of model in which we use this conceptual lab as a platform for both education and teaching, but also to do real research and to build databases and to put them online and to make available to the scholarly community a number of things that were never otherwise available, or certainly not freely. And it's a cross-departmental thing. We're working right now behind the scenes with the Epigraphy Center on campus, which is run by the Classics Department and has one of the largest squeeze collections of Attic Greek squeezes in North America. And all of their thousands of squeezes we're now putting into these elaborate, complicated databases to study them. And it's part of the task of the students, and it's helping to employ students on the side. So it's so far it's working. It's a lot of work, but you're right. As far as I understand, we are the only NELC, or as far as I understand, even ancient studies program of any kind that requires at least the PhD students to have training in a computer language before they leave.
I imagine artificial intelligence wasn't what it is today when you started this. How has AI changed what you're doing with the databases, and is it a tool that you recommend your students use?
So I do feel for my undergraduate students who take my classes but are engineering or software engineering majors and things like this, and they're on that track. I do feel for them because it's pretty clear that there's going to be a contraction in that domain. That said, AI has helped democratize a lot of the stuff that we as in the humanities who were underrepresented in funding and access, we now have access to. So for instance, I teach the students SQL. And the thing about SQL is that it's the back end. And while AI, I have adjusted the way I teach it, it's still, you have to know it. And you have to understand that computer language, even if you're going to use AI to facilitate your builds. Because you have to be able to ask AI the very specific questions to get the specific results that you need. And you have to understand the philosophy of databases to do this. So back-end work, I think there'll always be a level of employment there. In the humanities, it's only going to expand. And the need then for students to have that basic training is going to expand. What's nice is that now for the first time, these underfunded, underrepresented in the sciences research projects like what we do, we now have someone who can write code for us instantly that works, whereas it may have taken me 2 or 3 days to figure out how to write that code a few years ago. And sometimes you just have to train yourself in these computer languages because they're not all the same and they're doing different parts or different things and at different levels. But now, I never spent a lot of time working on Python, for instance. But it's fantastic to have this tool that can help me write Python scripts instantly, and they work. And that is a game changer. And so now I'm teaching the students how to integrate AI into into their work after they've learned the basics. You still have to learn the basics. And so we're doing a whole lot with this, but we're also doing it on a research level. I have some international collaborators that I'm working with and in that project, the goal is to continue to develop software with AI to help us more efficiently and quickly collect textual data, insert it, and analyze it. I try to emphasize automation and things, and so it's been great actually, from my point of view. And I'm happy to be at an institution that at least right now, one of the major messages is we need more of these discipline-specific instances of tech. Yeah, it's framed as AI, but it's even larger than that, I think. Right. And we have great resources here that will help us out. So
yeah, I want to speak about one of your other publications. While we still have time, you published an edition of Leviticus in the Syriac Peshitta, which I think is very important. For those uninitiated, can you tell us what is the Peshitta and what is different about it in general and Leviticus in particular compared to other collections of the Bible?
Yeah. So as a graduate student, I had just finished one MA in biblical languages and was moving on to, I was in the middle of finishing a second MA in Near Eastern studies. And it was at this time that George Kiraz, founder of Gorgeous Press, sent out word that he wanted to have an English translation of the Peshitta. The Peshitta is the ancient Syriac translation of the Bible, and both Hebrew Bible and New Testament, Old Testament and New Testament, as well as a number of the apocryphal books, most of them. It's a different thing. But I had worked under one of the first students of one of the great modern Leviticus scholars. Just finished working with him, and now I'm working with the most successful student under the other famous modern Leviticus scholar. And there was a need for the book of Leviticus to be translated. I had spent a couple of years reading Syriac already with my first advisor, and so it worked. And so, yeah, that was my first book, and I had so much help and advice was given from Don Walters and Gillian Greenberg. who helped me fine-tune the way I translated things and walked me through a lot of this. Those are two great Syriac scholars, modern Syriac scholars. Gillian passed away a while ago, and it was a great exercise. But I was in a NELCT program, and most Syriac studies are interested in church history, they're interested in reception, or they're interested in linguistics without really a strong historical anchor. I was a Northwest Semitic philologist and and I was working towards completing, actually, most of my work was in Assyriology. And so I used the leeway that George gave us to write a rather critical historical introduction to Leviticus, which took me then into comparative textual criticism. And I realized in that work that there was one manuscript in particular from the Dead Sea Scrolls that happened to agree mostly with the variants in Leviticus in the Peshitta manuscripts than it does with the Masoretic text or the Samaritan Pentateuch, and those are two textual families of ancient manuscripts. Those other two are in Hebrew, and then there's the Septuagint, which is in Greek, and then there's the Peshitta. These are the four major ones for Leviticus, and it seemed that this one Hebrew manuscript seemed to align a lot with the Peshitta. Now, to be fair, the margin of variance is very, very small. Leviticus was well canonized and copied well before the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts. We don't know when, Persian period I would put it, but it was. And so the manuscripts are very consistent, but there's this one that has variance. And then the unique thing is that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are very, very few Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible, of the Hebrew biblical books, or the Judean Hebrew books. And one of them is a section of Leviticus 16, which is probably liturgical, and it's one of the earliest evidences of an actual liturgical manuscript that we have in this tradition. And it's an Aramaic translation of Leviticus 16, and it was rather fascinating that the syntax, that was actually punctuated in most of these manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scroll or not, and the syntax of that and the punctuation seemed to also match the Peshitta, which was rather fascinating. And so I wrote this introduction. I don't think anyone's ever read it, but it was a fun and difficult enterprise as a graduate student to do. So, I thank you for bringing that up. I think Syriac studies is continuing to see a revival, and so hopefully we'll get more people interested in Syriac, and through these types of resources into the critical historical investigation of the texts also beyond the church historical approaches and linguistics.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, for students here at OSU, what classes can they take with you?
So we have just restructured our major. So we have, for the first time, starting ideally next year, an ancient Near Eastern studies track. So you can major in Near Eastern and South Asian languages and cultures, our department, and you get to pick a track, and one of your tracks now can be the ancient Near East. We've collected all ancient and critical Bible classes from across campus as well into that track from other departments like history and classics. And so that's one thing we're building. And as we're building that, I'm having to build more classes. Right now, I teach for the undergraduates mostly general ed classes, an introduction to Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. And then I teach what I'm teaching right now, which is the history of God. And then starting next fall or spring, I will be teaching an ancient economies class. And so those are the 3 undergraduate classes I try to keep in rotation right now. Hebrew Bible every year, and then rotate the other 2 in a sequence. And then for graduates, I teach all of the Northwest Semitic languages. So we do seminars in Hebrew Bible. I'm teaching Phoenician this semester. I taught Syriac last semester. I've taught Imperial Aramaic readings. I also do a lot of independent studies where graduate students will sit in on my Hebrew Bible class, but they will be working on Old Testament methodologies and writing seminar papers in that regard. So I teach a lot of things, and we're constantly reshaping this, especially depending on the body of graduate students that come in waves every few years. So.
Mm-hmm. And I want to speak a bit more about the so-called history of God class, which, I mean, of course, is the history of how people understand God and the communities that form and shapeshift, etc. That was a very interesting class, and the texts that you get to explore in that class are from ancient Mesopotamian creation myths like the Enuma Elish to works by Plato to St. Augustine's Confessions, the Gospels, and the Quran, and late antique Arabia. Could you speak a little bit about, you alluded to it before, this idea of like role play. How do you reconstruct all of these ancient communities and peoples in a classroom of students in a place as diverse as OSU?
Well, I think there does need to be some cultural sensitivity training that goes into reading, especially ancient creation myths. So if you read the creation myth between Enlil and Ninmah, for instance, from Sumer, that is not very politically correct these days, because it's a myth that really tries to explain the origins of human disabilities in a very comedic way. So there's levels of cultural training that go into just preparing students to read the myths. And then once we take flight, one of the class is structured with a couple of arcs. And the first arc is just to understand early Mesopotamian mythology. And the objective is to map out ancient Mesopotamian cosmology. How did they view the gods in relation to the natural world and in relation to death and what they see as their place in this time and the afterlife? So we map that out. My argument in that class is essentially that this is the Semitic, the ancient Near Eastern cosmology, and it certainly is standardized and nuanced in different locations and times, but I think that it is the model. There was a model behind this that even ancient Levantine, Eastern Mediterranean Levantine Semitic speakers, they also had the same cosmology. I think that if you take that premise, then you can go one more step and you can ask, okay, so how does monotheism develop? And that's where we start to explore mostly Judean texts, and then we take this sort of journey through monotheism as it develops, but then also as it branches out. And I run it along the lines of a handful of theses that I have in the class that help guide conversations. It's a rather fun class. I didn't. There's a huge bureaucracy at OSU and just getting classes approved. It can take years sometimes. And fortunately, my colleague, Michael Swartz, who just retired, he was the one that spearheaded this class and got it approved, but never got to teach it. And so there was a class on the books that I could use and I could make it my own. And I did that. And I take the students, once we get to monotheism, through the development of the ideas of death and life and the reinventing of God in different communities as historical circumstances change. Hellenism comes in, Greek education comes in, and so now people in the Levant and with the Semitic cosmology are now reading Plato, or at least Timaeus probably, and so, or at least are influenced by it, and therefore you've got all of these new changes in the cosmological picture. Research and development are happening on imperial levels in the Persian and Ptolemaic and Roman periods, and those are changing ideas of the cosmos and gods. And so we explore those questions, and then political activity is often a driving force of changing religion, and so we explore that. I'd start the students off by having them read a rather famous book by Thorkild Jakobsen, a great Sumerologist of the last generation, called The Treasures of Darkness. And at the end of his first chapter, he explains the domains from which religious thought originate in Mesopotamia. And he has 3 domains. First and foremost, religious thought develops from the economy. Secondly, it develops from the polity. And third, from the family unit. What ends up happening in the development of monotheism is there's a huge expansion in the domain of the judiciary that becomes a reference from which people writing what become religious texts will draw from. And so those 4 domains really are some of the driving forces, or some of the background or prerequisites knowledge we use to understand these texts as we go up to Muhammad and the Quran. And you can sometimes see genetic connections. It's a lot of fun, and it's a lot of fun to reflect on social and historical circumstances that are then codified in these religious texts as they develop, and sometimes in the case of the Jesus movement or Muhammad, spark whole new trajectories in human history. So,
one final question. As someone who's worked with a lot of wisdom literature, like that of Ahiqar, the story of Ahiqar, what piece of wisdom would you give to either an undergraduate version of yourself or your current students?
What comes to mind, inappropriately so, is Ahiqar tells his nephew, "Don't tell your secrets to your friends." I think the best thing to do, especially as a college student, is to try to find classes that make you think and help you build processes and methods to reflect on your own experience, but to use these case studies that are presented in a class, whether it's an ancient Near Eastern concept or a classics concept or a 19th century historical concept, and to use those as sort of safe spaces to work out how to develop a critical eye, how to frame and reframe a problem and a research question, and then maybe how to attack it and try to answer it. I think in today's world, again, you mentioned AI and everything. In today's world, we need very critical and thoughtful citizens. And so I think the best way to do that is through ancient content. And so, yeah, take our classes is what I would say. That's the best wisdom.
Well, well taken. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today about, your courses, your research, your own intellectual journey. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Salma.